every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Bhopal on the night of December 2, 1984, was cool and still. In the labyrinthine lanes of the shanty towns that pressed up against the walls of the Union Carbide pesticide plant, families slept soundly. J.P. Nagar, Kazi Camp, Chola Kenchi, these were communities of the working poor, people who had migrated to the city for a sliver of the modern world's promise, a promise embodied by the sprawling industrial complex that hummed quietly nearby. The plant, with its network of pipes, towers, and tanks, was a fixture on the horizon, a symbol of progress and employment. For most, it was just a part of the landscape, as mundane as the railway tracks that ran beside it. They were unaware that inside that landscape, a chemical reaction was beginning to spiral out of control, a furious, contained storm of heat and pressure building within a steel tank designated E610. There was no sound, no warning siren to pierce the quiet of the night. The first sign that something was wrong was a strange, sweet, yet sharp smell in the air, a scent that caught in the back of the throat. Then came the watering eyes, a stinging sensation that quickly escalated into a feeling like hot needles being jabbed into the cornea. A cough began, a dry, racking spasm that wouldn't stop. It felt as if the air itself, the very substance of life, had turned into acid. Panic began to ripple through the sleeping city. People woke up choking, their lungs on fire. They stumbled out of their homes, blind and disoriented, into a nightmare. The streets filled with screaming, gasping people, running in every direction, running from an enemy they couldn't see. They ran until their lungs gave out, falling in the streets, in the doorways of their homes, their bodies contorting in the final, agonizing throes of asphyxiation. This was not the loud, fiery violence of an explosion. This was a quiet, intimate, and suffocating death, delivered by the wind. What descended upon Bhopal that night was a fortitten cloud of methyl isocyanate, or mic, one of the most lethally toxic chemicals ever synthesized for industrial use. The immediate death toll was in the thousands. But that was only the beginning. The poison settled into the city's water, its soil, and into the very DNA of its people, leaving a legacy of chronic illness, birth defects, and suffering that continues to this day. The Bhopal disaster is often called the world's worst industrial accident, but the word accident implies a sudden, unforeseen, and unavoidable event. The catastrophe in Bhopal was none of those things. It was the endpoint of a long and meticulously documented chain of decisions, a slow-motion failure born of apathy, arrogance, and greed. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we are not dissecting the mind of a single killer, but the anatomy of a corporate catastrophe. We will investigate the culture of negligence that turned a factory of progress into a chemical weapon, and we will trace the decades-long, agonizing fight for justice that followed the night the poison fell from the sky. To understand how Bhopal became the site of such an unprecedented disaster, we must first understand the promise it once held. In the post-colonial era, India was a nation determined to modernize, to become self-sufficient, and to feed its burgeoning population. A key part of this national project was the Green Revolution, an ambitious agricultural initiative aimed at increasing crop yields through modern technology, including high-yield seeds, fertilizers, and, crucially, pesticides. It was into this environment of hope and ambition that the American multinational giant, Union Carbide Corporation, or UCC, stepped. In 1969, its Indian subsidiary, Union Carbide India Limited, or UCIL, established a plant in the central Indian city of Bhopal to formulate pesticides, initially by importing the dangerous chemical components from the United States. Bhopal was chosen for its central location and its excellent transport links. For the city, the arrival of a prestigious American company was a significant event. It brought jobs, investment, and a sense of being connected to the wider industrial world. By the late 1970s, UCIL decided to expand the plant to manufacture the pesticides from scratch, including the most volatile and dangerous component, methyl isocyanate. This process, known as backward integration, was seen as a major step forward, a mark of technological prowess for India. The plant would produce a popular and effective pesticide called 7. The heart of the 7 manufacturing process was mic. This chemical was not an ingredient in the final product. It was an intermediary, a chemical stepping stone. But it was a necessary one, and it was terrifyingly dangerous. Mic is a volatile liquid that boils at just over 39 degrees Celsius, meaning on a warm day, it can easily turn into a dense toxic gas that is heavier than air, allowing it to hug the ground and creep silently into low-lying areas. Inhalation is its primary route of exposure. Upon contact with moisture, like the moisture in human lungs, eyes, and airways, it transforms into a host of other toxic compounds, including hydrogen cyanide. It attacks the body with brutal efficiency. It causes searing pain in the eyes, leading to blindness. It triggers massive fluid buildup in the lungs, a condition called pulmonary edema, which is essentially a form of drowning on dry land. It damages the liver, the kidneys, and the immune system. Exposure to a high enough concentration for just a few minutes is fatal. Union Carbide knew this. Their own internal documents described mic as a known human toxin capable of causing fatal pulmonary edema. They understood they were dealing with a substance that afforded absolutely no margin for error. The systems designed to contain it had to be perfect, foolproof, and redundant. At their plant in Institute, West Virginia, they had built just such a system. But in Bhopal, they made different choices. The Union Carbide plant in Bhopal was not a mirror image of its American counterpart. From its very inception, it was designed and built to a different, less stringent standard of safety. This wasn't an oversight. It was a series of deliberate engineering and economic decisions. The American plant in West Virginia was highly computerized. Critical systems for monitoring temperature and pressure in the mic storage tanks were linked to a centralized computer system that could automatically detect anomalies and trigger alarms. In Bhopal, this monitoring was left to human operators, who had to manually log readings from gauges on the tanks themselves. This introduced the potential for human error and delayed response times, a critical flaw when dealing with a chemical that could undergo a runaway reaction in a matter of hours. The very materials used in the plant's construction spoke to a double standard. In the United States, UCC used stainless steel for pipes and valves in the mic unit, which is highly resistant to corrosion. In Bhopal, they used carbon steel, which is cheaper but far more susceptible to corrosion. This decision increased the risk of leaks and contamination, the very kind of contamination that could trigger a catastrophic reaction. The storage of mic itself was a major point of divergence. In West Virginia, UCC stored mic in multiple small, partially buried tanks. This was a crucial safety feature. Smaller quantities meant any potential leak would be less severe, and burying the tanks helped keep the chemical cool and stable. In Bhopal, against the advice of their own internal safety auditors, UCC installed 2 massive above-ground storage tanks, capable of holding over 40 tons of mica each. This was done for economic reasons, to facilitate bulk storage and reduce costs. It also created the potential for a single failure to release a horrifyingly large amount of poison, turning a potential incident into a city-killing catastrophe. These were not the only flaws. They were simply the foundational ones, built into the very bones of the plant. As the 1980s began, the Bhopal plant, which had once been a source of pride for UCIL, became a financial drain. The demand for 7-pesticide never reached the projected levels, partly due to widespread drought and poverty among Indian farmers. The plant was losing money, and the pressure from corporate headquarters in Danbury, Connecticut, to cut costs became relentless. This corporate mandate to slash expenses would systematically dismantle the few safety systems the plant did have, transforming it from a flawed facility into a ticking time bomb. The anatomy of the disaster was being assembled, piece by piece, through line items on a balance sheet thousands of miles away. The drive to cut costs manifested in 1,000 ways, each one stripping away another layer of safety. The workforce was a primary target. Experienced, highly trained engineers and operators were replaced with less qualified workers who received significantly less training. Between 1980 and 1984, the crew size for the mica unit was cut in half, from 12 operators to 6. The maintenance supervisor position was eliminated entirely. Training periods for new hires were drastically reduced from 6 months down to just 15 days. Manuals were often available only in English, a language many of the new workers could not fluently read. This meant that the people tasked with handling one of the world's most dangerous chemicals often lacked a fundamental understanding of the plant's chemistry and its safety protocols. They were being set up to fail. Maintenance budgets were also slashed. The result was a plant in a state of perpetual decay. Leaks of various toxic chemicals became a depressingly common occurrence. Workers complained of faulty gauges, corroded pipes, and broken valves. Instead of replacing failing equipment, the management often sanctioned makeshift repairs or simply ignored the problems. A culture of making do replaced a culture of safety. The plant's own internal safety audits repeatedly flagged serious concerns. A 1982 report, conducted by experts from UCC in the United States, identified 10 major safety deficiencies in the mica unit, including the potential for a runaway reaction. The report was sent to management in both India and the U.S. No significant action was taken. The warnings were filed away, and the cost-cutting continued. The most critical failures, however, were in the plant's 6 dedicated safety systems designed specifically to prevent a release of mica gas. By December 1984, not one of them was fully operational. The first line of defense was a refrigeration unit, designed to keep the mica in tank 610 cool to near 0 degrees Celsius. Keeping the chemical cool was essential to keeping it stable and preventing any accidental reactions. This unit had been shut down in June of 1984 to save about $30 a day in electricity costs. The mica was being stored at ambient temperature, around 20 degrees Celsius, significantly increasing its volatility and shortening the time it would take for a runaway reaction to occur. The second safety system was the vent gas scrubber. This was a tower designed to neutralize any escaping mica gas by spraying it with a solution of caustic soda. On the night of the disaster, the scrubber was on, but it was in a standby mode. More importantly, The pressure and temperature gauges for the unit had not worked for over a week, and its circulation pump was known to be faulty. Even if it had been fully operational, it was designed to handle only small, routine leaks, not the massive high-pressure release that was about to occur. It would have been completely overwhelmed. The third system was a flare tower, a tall stack designed to burn off any gas that bypassed the scrubber. It was essentially a giant pilot light for burning away poison before it could reach the atmosphere. The flare tower could have been a last line of defense, but a section of connecting pipe had corroded and had not been replaced. The entire system was out of service and had been for weeks. A fourth system, a network of water cannons, was intended to spray a mist of water into the air to knock down any escaped gas, but the cannons were designed for fighting fires, not a toxic gas release. Their jets were not powerful enough to reach the height of the vent stack from which the mic was escaping. They were effectively useless. Finally, there was the alarm system. There was an alarm specifically intended to warn the surrounding public of a toxic gas leak. This alarm was turned off. The plant management had made a conscious decision to rely solely on an internal alarm that could only be heard by the workers, so as not to cause panic in the nearby communities. The final layer of protection, the one that could have given people a few precious minutes to flee, had been deliberately silenced. Each of these failures, the decommissioned refrigeration, the standby scrubber, the disconnected flare tower, the inadequate water cannons, the silent public alarm, was the result of a specific choice made to save a small amount of money. Together, they constituted a total and catastrophic failure of the duty of care, a complete abdication of corporate responsibility. The warnings of impending doom were not confined to internal safety reports. They were shouted, printed, and pleaded by those who could see the disaster unfolding. Rajkumar Kaswani, a local investigative journalist in Bhopal, became a Cassandra figure, publishing a series of articles in a small local paper with chillingly prophetic titles like Bhopal, Sitting on the Brink of a Volcano, and If You Don't Understand, You Will Be Wiped Out. Starting in 1982, Kaswani meticulously documented the plant's safety failures, the worker complaints, and the extreme danger of mic. He wrote letters to government officials, to the plant management, and even to Union Carbide's headquarters, begging them to take action. He was universally ignored, dismissed as a sensationalist fearmonger. Inside the plant, workers and union leaders were also raising the alarm. They staged protests over the deteriorating safety conditions and the staff cuts. In 1981, a worker named Muhammad Ashraf died after being exposed to a phosgene gas leak, another highly toxic chemical used in the mic process. In another incident, 25 workers were hospitalized due to a leak. The union repeatedly sent letters and petitions to management, detailing their specific fears about the mic unit. They knew the plant was unsafe. They knew that the combination of failing equipment, undertrained staff, and a highly volatile chemical was a recipe for tragedy. Their concerns were met with indifference and, at times, intimidation. Management assured them everything was under control. The plant was safe. The community was safe. But by the evening of Sunday, December 2, 1984, all the pieces for the catastrophe were in place. The plant was a ghost ship, its safety systems disabled, its crew unprepared, sailing directly into a storm of its own making. The immediate trigger for the disaster began with a routine maintenance task. A set of pipes leading from the mic production unit needed to be flushed with water to clear out clogs. This was a standard procedure. However, a critical safety device, known as a slip-line, a solid metal disc, designed to completely isolate the pipes being cleaned from the rest of the system, was not inserted. This failure, likely due to a combination of poor training and a lax safety culture, meant that there was now a direct, albeit valve-protected connection between the water lines and the mic storage tanks. Sometime in the late evening, around 10:20 p.m., water began to flow through the pipes, past leaking valves, and into tank 610. Inside the tank, the water met nearly 42 tons of methyl isocyanate. The reaction was immediate and violent. Water acts as a powerful catalyst with mic, kicking off an exothermic reaction, a process that generates an enormous amount of heat. The presence of iron from the corroding carbon steel walls of the tank further accelerated this runaway reaction. The temperature inside tank 610 began to climb rapidly. The design specifications stated the temperature should never exceed 25 degrees Celsius. By 11:30 p.m., operators in the control room noticed that the pressure in the tank was rising. The gauge, which normally read around 2 pounds per square inch, or psi, was now at 10 psi and climbing. This should have been an immediate red flag, but the operators on duty were relatively inexperienced. They initially dismissed the reading as a likely instrument error, a common occurrence in the poorly maintained plant. By midnight, the situation had become undeniable. The pressure gauge was now rocketing past 25 psi. The concrete casing of the tank began to groan and crack under the immense strain. A supervisor ordered the operators to check the tank manually. What they felt was a wall of heat radiating from the steel. The reaction inside was now unstoppable. Panic set in. They tried to activate the emergency systems. They turned on the vent gas scrubber, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume and pressure of the gas roaring into it. They tried to use the water cannons, but the spray fell short. There was nothing they could do. The temperature inside the tank soared past 200 degrees Celsius, and the pressure climbed to a point where it blew the tank's emergency safety valve. At approximately 12:40 a.m. on December 3rd, a deafening roar echoed through the plant as a massive plume of dense white gas erupted from a vent, stack 120 feet in the air. For the next 2 hours, over 40 tons of a chemical cocktail, primarily composed of methyl isocyanate, shot out of the tank and into the cold night air. The cool, still conditions of the winter night were tragically perfect for maximizing the gas lethal potential. Instead of dispersing quickly into the upper atmosphere, the dense, heavy clouds sank, hugging the ground and being gently pushed by a southeasterly breeze directly over the sleeping, low-income neighborhoods of Old Bhopal. J.P. Nagar, just across the street from the plant, was the first to be engulfed. Then the cloud crept onward, through the railway station, across the city, an invisible tsunami of poison, leaving a carpet of death in its wake. The scene in the city was one of apocalyptic chaos. As the gas cloud settled, it was as if the air itself had become a weapon. People woke up to a searing pain in their eyes, a sensation so intense it felt as if their eyeballs were melting. Their lungs filled with fluid, and they began to cough up bloody, frothy sputum. The instinct was to run, but running only made it worse, as the increased respiration pulled more of the poison deep into their lungs. The streets became a tangled mass of humanity, a desperate, stampeding exodus to nowhere. People were running blind, their eyes swollen shut. Children were separated from their parents in the darkness and confusion. Entire families died together in their homes, too slow or too weak to escape. The Hamidia Hospital, Bhopal's largest medical facility, was completely unprepared for the deluge of victims that began to flood its gates. At first, a few dozen arrived, then hundreds, then thousands. They came on foot, in auto-rickshaws, piled onto carts or carried by relatives. They were all suffering from the same horrific symptoms: temporary or permanent blindness, uncontrollable coughing, and severe respiratory distress. The hospital's staff had no idea what was happening. They had received no warning from the Union Carbide plant. They didn't know what chemical they were dealing with, and they had no idea how to treat it. They could only offer symptomatic relief, washing out eyes and administering oxygen, but their supplies were exhausted within hours. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, but they were fighting a losing battle. The sheer number of victims was overwhelming. The hospital corridors, floors, and even the grounds outside became a sea of the dead and dying. As the sun rose on the morning of December 3rd, the true scale of the horror was revealed. The streets of Bhopal were littered with the bodies of the dead, men, women, and children who had fallen where they ran. The bodies of cows, goats, and dogs lay among them, a testament to the indiscriminate lethality of the gas. The initial official death toll was placed at around 2,259, but this was a gross underestimate. Activist groups and subsequent studies placed the number of immediate deaths closer to 8,000, with another 15,000 to 20,000 people dying from gas-related illnesses in the years that followed. In a single night, Union Carbide had inflicted more death and suffering than any single act of terrorism in history. The cleanup of the dead was a grim and heartbreaking task, with mass burials and cremations taking place for days. The city of Bhopal was traumatized, its people poisoned, its future irrevocably scarred. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Union Carbide Corporation's response set the tone for the decades of legal and moral evasion that would follow. The company immediately went on the defensive. Their chairman and CEO, Warren Anderson, flew to India, where he was briefly arrested and charged with culpable homicide before being released on bail. He was quickly flown out of the country on a government plane and never returned to face the charges. He would remain a fugitive from Indian justice for the rest of his life. Publicly, the corporation expressed sympathy, but privately, their legal and public relations machinery went into overdrive to deflect blame and minimize liability. Their primary strategy was to construct an alternative narrative, a theory that would absolve them of negligence. This became known as the sabotage theory. Union Carbide claimed that the disaster was not the result of design flaws or cost-cutting, but a deliberate act of sabotage by a single disgruntled employee. They alleged that a worker had intentionally connected a water hose directly to the mic tank, introducing the water that caused the reaction. They even named a specific employee, claiming he was angry with management and wanted to spoil a batch of product. This theory was incredibly convenient for UCC. If they could prove sabotage, the disaster would be the result of a criminal act by an individual, not the foreseeable outcome of corporate negligence. They would be the victims, not the perpetrators. However, the sabotage theory has been widely and thoroughly debunked. Investigations by journalists, scientists, and activists have shown it to be a fabrication with no credible evidence to support it. The worker named by UCC had a solid alibi and vehemently denied the accusation. Furthermore, the engineering and chemical evidence simply doesn't add up. For the sabotage theory to be true, the worker would have had to gather a significant length of hose, find the right fittings, climb the structure of the tank in the dark, and somehow force a massive amount of water against the high pressure inside the tank, all without being seen by any of the other workers on duty. It is a technically implausible scenario. The far simpler and more evidence-based explanation is the one supported by the plant's own logbooks. Water entered the tank through the network of pipes during the routine flushing operation, made possible by the failure to install the slip line and the presence of leaking valves, a direct result of the poor maintenance and lax safety procedures that had become standard practice at the plant. The sabotage theory was not a genuine investigation. It was a cynical legal strategy designed to protect the corporation's assets at the expense of the truth. The legal battle for compensation became a grueling, decades-long ordeal for the survivors. The Indian government, claiming to act as the sole representative of the victims, filed a lawsuit against Union Carbide in the United States. However, in a controversial legal move, UCC successfully argued for the case to be moved to India under a legal doctrine known as forum non-conveniens, claiming that India was the more appropriate venue. Critics argue this was a strategic move to take the case out of the robust American tort system and into the slower, less plaintiff-friendly Indian legal system, where potential damages would be far lower. Finally, in 1989, the Indian Supreme Court approved a settlement between the Indian government and Union Carbide. UCC agreed to pay $470 million in compensation for all civil and criminal claims related to the disaster. In exchange, all pending and future charges against the company and its officials were dropped. The settlement was an unmitigated disaster for the victims. When distributed among the more than 500,000 people who were officially recognized as having been affected, the amount came down to a pittance. For those with lifelong debilitating injuries, the compensation was often as little as $500. For the families of the dead, it was barely a few thousand. It was a sum that in no way reflected the scale of the loss of life, the permanent health damage, and the multi-generational suffering inflicted upon the people of Bhopal. The settlement was widely condemned by survivor groups and human rights organizations as a betrayal. They argued that the government, eager to maintain a business-friendly image and attract foreign investment, had settled for a fraction of what was just. The criminal charges were later reinstated by the Indian Supreme Court after public outcry, but the legal process dragged on for another 2 decades. In 2010, 26 years after the disaster, an Indian court finally delivered a verdict. 7 former Indian employees of UCIL, all of them elderly men, were convicted of death by negligence. Their sentence was 2 years in prison and a fine of about $2,000 each. They were immediately released on bail and never spent a day in jail. No American executive, including Warren Anderson, was ever brought to justice. The man who presided over the corporation responsible for thousands of deaths died a free man in Florida in 2014. The legacy of the Bhopal disaster extends far beyond the courtroom. It is etched into the bodies of the survivors and their children. The long-term health consequences have been devastating. Survivors suffer from a horrifying array of chronic illnesses, respiratory problems like fibrosis and asthma, neurological damage, reproductive health issues, and an increased risk of cancer. A generation of children born to parents who were exposed to the gas have suffered from a high rate of birth defects, developmental delays, and growth disorders. The poison of that one night seeped into the city's gene pool, creating an echo of the catastrophe that will last for generations. Furthermore, the site of the Union Carbide plant remains a source of ongoing contamination. When UCC abandoned the plant, they left behind thousands of tons of toxic waste and contaminated materials. These poisons have been slowly leaching into the soil and the groundwater for decades, contaminating the drinking water of the surrounding communities. This has created a second slow-motion disaster, as residents who were not even alive in 1984 are now being poisoned by the contaminated water they rely on for drinking, cooking, and bathing. The Dow Chemical Company, which acquired Union Carbide in 2001, has refused to accept any liability for cleaning up the site, arguing that the 1989 settlement resolved all of UCC's responsibilities in India. The plant now stands as a rusted, decaying monument to corporate impunity, its grounds a toxic wasteland that continues to poison the people of Bhopal. The fight for a comprehensive cleanup and for clean drinking water is the new front line in the battle for justice. The anatomy of the Bhopal disaster is, in the end, the anatomy of indifference. It reveals how a series of small, seemingly rational business decisions, when compounded, can lead to an outcome of almost unimaginable horror. Every cost-cutting measure, every ignored warning, every disabled safety system was a conscious choice. It was a choice that prioritized marginal profit gains over the sanctity of human life. The disaster was not simply a technical failure. It was a moral failure on an epic scale. It exposed the stark double standards that multinational corporations often applied, operating with a level of safety in developing nations that would have been illegal and unthinkable in their home countries. The people of Bhopal were seen as expendable, their lives valued at a steep discount. Bhopal became a landmark case in corporate law and environmental justice. It demonstrated the profound difficulty of holding a powerful multinational corporation accountable, especially when it can hide behind complex legal structures, international borders, and compliant governments. The settlement, which was presented as a resolution, was in fact a continuation of the injustice, quantifying human life in a way that was insulting and grossly inadequate. It set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that corporations could cause catastrophic harm in foreign lands and then buy their way out of true accountability for a relatively small price. The lessons of Bhopal are many, but the most important is that such disasters are never truly accidents. They are the predictable and preventable consequences of a system that devalues safety and externalizes the true costs of its operations onto vulnerable communities and the environment. The story is a chilling reminder of what happens when the pursuit of profit is completely divorced from ethical responsibility. It is a testament to the courage of the survivors and activists who have refused to be silenced, who have fought for more than 4 decades, not just for compensation, but for a simple acknowledgement of the truth, that their loved ones were not killed by a tragic accident, but by a calculated and lethal apathy. The rusted shell of the Union Carbide plant still stands on the edge of the city, a skeletal ruin overgrown with weeds. It is not just a relic of a tragic past, but an active, ongoing crime scene. Its contaminated soil and the poisons that still seep from its grounds serve as a permanent testament to a corporate debt that was never paid, and a wound that has never been allowed to heal. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.